How's it going, Woods and Forests community? I'm here with probably one of the most exciting guests that I could have ever gotten on this podcast. It's going to be an amazing episode. We have Phil, and Phil is an Australian photographer, but I'm not going to talk too much because I'm going to let Phil introduce himself. But it'll be great to get back into talking about some frogs and wildlife. I know we've had a few weeks, a bunch of episodes on the podcasts of geography and drones and stuff like that, but we all know that this is definitely a frog channel, frogs and toads and different herps first, but it's nice to have a good conversation with somebody who has been such a highly anticipated guest on the podcast. So Phil, the floor is yours. Go ahead and share with us, who you are, what you do, and give people some sense of how this conversation's happening. We're different parts of the world right now making this work.
Absolutely. Well, Aaron, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. You'll probably be a bit confused for those who are listening, thinking he doesn't sound very Australian. I grew up in Liverpool, England, and being very limited for frog fauna over there, I decided to move over to Australia when I was in my late 20s. So I arrived in Australia in 2010, and so I've been here for nearly 14 years. And it's been amazing. I've been able to, I've lived in many, many different parts of this continent and I've been working my way through a lot of the different species of frogs, especially on the east coast of Australia. Currently, I'm living in the Gold Coast, which is about halfway up the east coast, and it's considered subtropical where I'm based. So the frog fauna is very diverse. I guess just going back to childhood, I was always nuts about insects and animals, and my sisters tell me stories about me, trying to grab bees out of flowers when I was still in a diaper, crawling around, and always rolling rocks and logs looking for beetles and spiders, and would have my next door neighbour tinning over his logs to show me what's under his logs next door, and the passion began there. Like spiders and beetles were my first love. Just obsessed with arachnids and predatory Arab beetles. And just I had I guess a good childhood in that my parents let me sort of build amphibian ponds, and I ended up with like 5 ponds in the back garden, and it was like a big production line for the European common frogs, and we have the newts over there, so the smooth newts and the palmate newts would breed regularly, and so it was great. And then I really got into I had my first exotic at the age of 8. I got a chili rose tarantula for my 8th birthday, and that was so cool, having a spider from the tropics in a big aquarium. And then that led on to, like, I got a pet scorpion, an imperial scorpion from Southeast Asia. Then I got a pair of hissing cockroaches and bred them and loved those massive roaches from Madagascar. And then I started keeping geckos and skinks, and that led to tree frogs and leopard geckos and pythons and and then I just ended up with about 15 or 20 vivariums with everything from praying mantises to white tree frogs to edible frogs from Europe, fire salamanders, tiger salamanders, tokay geckos, Cuban anoles. Convinced me mum and dad for my 14th birthday to turn an old fireplace into like a giant vivarium, and just turned it into a bit of a rainforest, and had a big, over a meter long green iguana. The Asian water dragons, the tokay geckos lived at the back. I even had cane toads at the bottom in the ponds, and it was
Wow.
just a brilliant ecosystem. So I was just very lucky that my parents encouraged that my subject and allowed my passion to flow, because that wouldn't have been. I guess a lot of parents wouldn't want those kind of animals in the house, bird-eating spiders and things like that. But I was very lucky in that way. So it kind of started with the captivity side of things, and I was always observing these animals in the wild. In Liverpool, there's some really good habitat for the endangered natterjack toad, which is it's where it lives in coastal dunes. A lot of those areas have obviously been cleared, so they're hanging in there. But the Sefton Coast, which is just 40 minutes north of where I'm from, has a really good breeding population of them. So I used to go out every spring and see them, and they're breeding these little blowouts, we call them, just in the very um, like very minimal to no vegetation, just pools that collect in the sand dunes, and the natterjacks come out a lot later, late spring, like April, May, and they'll be breeding there. And obviously, the European common toad used to love going out and looking for them in February, March. They were out much earlier in the spring. Same with the frogs, and then it was such a treat when you got to see the great crested newts, which are just, I mean, once they've fully got their crest out, the males, the colorations and the patterns on them, and the bright orange and black blotchy underbelly, just watching them doing their displays underwater where the males would be, sending the pheromones over to the female and doing a little dance, and the male will sort of lead the female over to the sperm packet he leaves on the floor. And I just grew up observing all this stuff all my life, and so I just lived, ate and breathed it, from day one, I guess. But I think it was around when I was in my early 20s that I thought I really need, because I'd worked in pet shops and stuff like that, but I thought, how do I get into this as a proper career? And so I went back to college, done an access to science course, went and studied zoology, done an honors degree in zoology. And that was fantastic because I got to go to the American tropics sort of as part of the course. So I spent like 2 months in Honduras collecting baseline data on reptiles and amphibians in the Cuzco National Park up in the cloud forests for the first few weeks, and then down in the lowlands jungles in El Periso near the border of Guatemala. That was probably the majority of the survey was sampling in the lowland jungles, and it just blew me away. Just going to the American tropics and first stepping foot in a rainforest and just coming across the abundance of animals and the diversity. It just blew my mind. And that was a big reason where, I knew uni was going to be a challenge, but I thought, you know what, if I can get to go to like the Amazon or something like that during the course, I'll have something to reach towards. And that's what I thrive on is the field work. Really, really, really enjoyed that. And Honduras, I mean, I've got endless stories about Honduras. I went back after graduation. I went to work for the same organization, well, volunteer for them. So I got to spend another 2 months out in Honduras doing similar work, and then got to sort of go off backpacking around some of the islands off the coast there, and seen a couple of weeks of Belize, a few days of Guatemala. But I really got into the Central American frogs and salamanders, and just to see salamanders that were arboreal. I'd never seen anything like it. Like what I know is salamanders, the ground dwelling, quite heavy set animals, and these ones in the under the genus Bolitoglossa, they've got like fused feet, and they kind of like crawl around on the vegetation like chameleons almost. You find them at like waist or chest high up on the vegetation along the paths. It was just like I've never seen anything quite like that. So obviously I fell in love with Central America and the species there, and wow, that was just one of the best times of my life by a mile, those 2 summers. But in terms of Australia, after I graduated from uni, I got a job in the Liverpool Museum, pretty much next door to the uni. And the job was, I guess it was more, there was two levels, and I was working across the two levels. One was the bug house, so they had, huge tarantulas on display, scorpions, leafcutter ants, whip scorpions, hissing cockroaches. And then we had, below that was in a marine aquarium. And I've always had an interest in marine stuff, just didn't know as much about it as the freshwater ecosystems. But I got this job, and for 3 years I was moving between the two floors, and it took me a good year, but it convinced the bosses to allow me to put amphibians on display. So I brought my collection into the museum, and we had these oriental fire-bellied toads on display, and I was breeding them at the time. And so the public were just, they were, because they're so active in the day, the fire-bellied, so they're really entertaining for the public to watch. And then I had a bunch of other stuff in the back, like the albino horned frog, African bullfrog, my pet cane toads, and so on. And that was fantastic. That job was like a good mixture of animal husbandry, education, research. So we'd have like school groups come in and do talks on these animals, insects and crabs and things like that, and blow them up on the projector so the kids could see all the feeding mouth parts, and I'd just bring it to life and just get really animated and just get the kids really interested in conservation. And any chance I get, I was on the stage in the theatre doing talks on amphibian conservation. I just volunteered to do them, partly because I wanted to get over my fear of public speaking. Partly, I wanted to convey that message to anyone that would listen. So I was showing the public just how to put frog-friendly ponds in the back garden and what to stay away from, what to encourage, things like that. And then we had some interesting research projects going on that were not to do with frogs. It was we were looking at rays, so like not stingrays because they don't actually have a sting, but they're called skates around the UK, and they're pretty big. They'll get like good meter and a half across, sometimes 2 meters. Quite big animals. But we were working with a lot of the fishermen, and they were helping us tag these rays, and we were kind of, I guess, seeing how big they'd grown, how their disc width had grown, and where they'd traveled to. And we were looking at them in the Liverpool Bay area, because in the summer they kind of leave the Irish Sea and come into the River Mersey, where it's a bit warmer, and it's just very silty and full of crabs and all the stuff they like to eat. So that was interesting. That was a nice bit of research. We were doing some stuff on jellyfish as well in the quarantine rooms. But yeah, where I thrived was just doing. I was working with a guy called Kerry Krieger, and we were kind of doing Save the Frogs days in the museum, and I had all trails for the kids, little prizes they can win, and just trying to get people fired up about amphibian conservation, really. But that was the museum. I decided to obviously move over to Australia then. So I'd done 3 years at the museum, and so I landed here in 2010 in the October. And that was just at the start of the wet season up in Darwin in the Northern Territory. I timed it that way and specifically because I knew all the frogs are going to be active. The crocodiles are out, the snakes are active. It was just herpetofauna heaven up there. It really was. And I've got stories about Darwin, but yeah, and from then, life's just been amazing. I've just had access to this stuff that I can go and see in the wild now. You know what I mean? It's just mind blowing.
That's really
But if
awesome.
there's any, it is just ask me if there's anything specific you want me to talk about. I'll happy to go down that avenue. But like the Australian story has been obviously a 14 years in the making. So just wherever you want me to go with that. I've got a few different ideas, but you just fire away any questions, Aaron.
Yeah, we could start with talking about Australia and then make our way into talking about Borneo and Honduras as well. So for Australia, so you moved over there 14 years ago. I guess one of the first things I want to ask as you lead into talking about the diversity, have you seen different frog or any of the herpetofauna species declining since you've started over 14 years?
So when I arrived in Australia, people would tell me, not so much when I was living in Darwin, but when I moved to Brisbane. So I started off on the very top of Australia, up in Darwin, right in the middle, right up in the north end. Then I kind of moved around, and when I was living in Brisbane, I'd go out with the frog and tadpole group. They were telling me that the sightings of the green tree frogs had declined in the inner suburbs around Brisbane. So they were having to drive further out, to the outer suburbs to sort of still find them and photograph them and stuff. So I guess in terms of what I've seen in a pattern, I feel like this was already going on when I got there. So I hadn't actually seen that with my own eyes, but from what the people that had grown up there were telling me, I could kind of understand what they were saying. We were driving 40 minutes into the suburbs, into some state forests to find and photograph the green tree frogs in good numbers. But they were telling me just even in the 80s and stuff, that they were very, very common in the inner suburbs. And so I guess in that way, yeah, I could totally relate from what they were telling me.
When you say the green tree frog, do you mean like the White's tree
Oh, sorry,
frog
the
or the white?
white tree frog. Yeah,
No
white tree
problem.
frog. Yeah,
I know in
yeah,
Australia it's common. It is the green tree frog where you guys are, but we have a very small frog in the United States in the southeast called the green tree frog. So just so
that's right.
viewers don't get confused, but yeah, I was wondering because I know there's the real big, the white lip one, and then there's the White's tree frog. But that's really sad to hear that uh, it's been going on for longer than I thought because I read a story that the museum had spoken or written out about the White's tree frog. I think it was in Melbourne that they were finally declining or they reported a decline, but from what you're saying, it sounds like it's been going on longer than that.
Yeah, look, the white tree frog. It's funny because I grew up calling them the white tree frog. I had the shower units full of them, just trying to breed them when I was a young fella. And then I come over here and everyone's like, "What are you on about, a white tree frog?" And so I had to switch over to the Aussie way and call it a green tree frog. But I'd also kept the North American green tree frogs as pets growing up. I think it was the first pet frog I ever had in a vivarium was a green tree frog. So sorry for the confusion. I'll switch to
Oh
the old
no,
way I
you're
used
good.
to call them.
You can call them the green tree
Um,
frog now. I think now that we cleared that up, people like they could accept the culture,
yeah,
so it's fine.
yeah. But going back to what you were saying there with the declines, yeah, it is sad. I mean, if I grew up here, it would have been devastating to see that. You know, I seen changes in the UK with amphibians, and I guess the locals would have really noticed. You know, because they're so loud, the white tree frogs when they call. I mean, they really go off, and it's noticeable when they're no longer turning up in your garden pond or hanging around the sort of local neighbors' gardens and things like that. But yeah, I guess with if you think about it, like just the amount of ditches that get filled in for mosquito control, and you've got a lot of the waterways have those mosquito fish in, and they can be really detrimental to tadpoles and eggs, and they're quite aggressive, those fish, and they've been introduced into a lot of the waterways, which hasn't favored a lot of amphibians. Um, then you've got obviously insecticide use and development, and then chytrid fungus was brought here, and there's been at least two extinctions that I know of, or six, but two fairly recent in the 80s and early 90s, of frogs that were once very abundant, and then they just suddenly, almost like your golden toad in Costa Rica, just sort of vanished overnight. And it's really alarming, especially that they were living in pristine habitats, kind of similar to what's been going on in Panama and Central America. Um, and it's just, they're so vulnerable, aren't they? They really are. Like they just absorb through the skin, what's in the air, in the water. They're just so sensitive to any change. And I guess Australia is no exception in that way. That the amount, the rate of land clearing over here, I really thought they were more, I guess, around the conservation here. I grew up kind of thinking that about Australia, but the rates they clear in land and native forest here is alarming. And yeah, it's a real shame, not just for the frogs, but all the fauna that relies on it.
I'm surprised to hear that. I have a friend who, do you know who Forrest Galante is? The guy on Animal Planet. He did Extinct or Alive. So I have a friend who is involved
Yeah.
with them, and he was saying on their Discord, there's a guy who's from Australia, and he was talking about deforestation. And like us in America, I don't think anybody really thinks about that because they see all the fantastic documentaries and all of the work that your conservation groups do, and everybody just assumes that that's how it is. But I think that's a important wake up call that people need to understand too. It's not just in the United States or in Canada or Mexico. Like it happens in Australia just like it does everywhere else.
Absolutely. The region I live in now in the Gold Coast, just south of here, and you cross a border into northern New South Wales into a different state. I think that's where you read about the green tree frogs declining because they don't live in Melbourne, they don't live in Victoria. That's the only state you don't get the white tree frogs in the whole country. But they, in terms of like what they've done to just because that would have been some of the biggest tract of rainforest in in the country in northern New South Wales, but a lot of that was cleared for cattle, cattle country basically. So you've got these lovely rolling green hills and pockets of rainforest, but it was once blanketed, and the whole region was, yeah, it was even bigger than the Daintree rainforest up in the far north Queensland. Luckily, they've saved huge chunks of it and turned them into national parks. Like if I drive 45 minutes to an hour inland, I get to Springbrook National Park, and it's just incredible. Subtropical rainforest, endless waterfall walks. You go at night in the rainy season, and you'll count like 12 different species of frogs in like the first hour. It really goes off. So I'm really grateful they've actually secured big tracts of these mountain ranges. You got Springbrook and Lamington in particular, huge plateaus and just so diverse and in such good shape. You can see some of the really ancient primary rainforest, some of these trees with girths of like 3, 4, 5 meters, insane. But yeah, to think what it used to be like, and even the Gold Coast where I live, this would have been like huge big wetlands, almost a bit like Florida, loads of
Wow.
estuaries, yeah, and it was drained and carved up into canals with all these lovely homes, and it's yeah, you just think, God, what did this look like 100 years ago? Because it's only quite recent, the development. This Where I live is now an up and coming city, but it's still quite small for the city. But not that long ago, like 40, 50 years ago, it was very rural. There was a lot of expansive wetlands and swamp forest and paperbark forest, and yeah, there's been a lot of changes in the last few decades here for sure, which will have only impacted the frogs in a negative way, unfortunately.
Is
Saying that though, Aaron, even though I live right in the centre of town, I I've got a green tree frog a white tree frog that calls on my balcony. I drove to work recently and I opened my boot. One had gotten inside, like kind of in the little rim under the door in the booth. I opened the door. It was right there. And where I was working was an even big expanse of forest and wetland. So it was almost perfect. They got to let that white tree frog go in a wetland as opposed to it living around like a resort here. But they do, when they're in the urban areas, they do well. Like you always find them in the downpipes. You know the way they love to call and resonate the call in like hollows. They'll obviously do it in tree trunks and things like that in the wild, but around our houses in the suburbs, they'll do it from the downpipe. So you drain on the sort of roof. For the first time, I seen one in a toilet at a friend's wedding about a year ago. I've been waiting for that moment where I lift up the bowl and it's just sitting in the water. I couldn't believe it. It finally happened after living here for 12, 13 years. Um, and they just, as long as they've got the basics and they're so like hardy, in terms of just storing that water in those big, thick eyebrows. And my friend does the fauna surveying and he's works way, like, I'm talking like super inland, like hundreds and hundreds of kilometers inland on black soil, like where the black soil's all cracked, like real black soil country. And the white tree frogs, even in the dry season, they're right down in those cracks. So when they start, putting a gas pipe in and he's doing the fauna survey and catching them and trying to like limit the damage to the environment, he just couldn't believe how resilient and hardy these things are and where they're existing. It's almost like bloody desert out there, you know what I mean? And they're hanging in there in these giant cracks in the soil. Um, so luckily, the white tree frogs they've pretty much covered like every habitat in Australia. Their range is huge, and you'll find them in anything from rainforest to um, eucalypt forest to sort of human habitation to those real outback areas where it's cracked soil plains. You'll find them in paperbark swamps. You'll find them in like dry forest. Like they just seem to have adapted and exploited every possible habitat here. It's quite amazing, really.
so the white's tree frog. Have you observed them eating other frogs and toads or other like rare, like unique vertebrates because a lot of people in the pet trade talk about them being carnivores, and I mean, you could see on my logo, Max, the White's tree frog up there. I've had her, this is going on 10 years, but I could definitely see her eating another frog.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I've never personally witnessed them eat another frog, but I did have a friend who managed to get a photograph of a white tree frog eating a small snake called a bandy band. So black and white banded snake. Snake's probably 15 centimeters or so, and he's got some really good images of the white tree frog just stuffing it in its mouth. I mean, they'll take bats regularly. Friends
Wow.
of mine have, yeah, they hang around the entrance of caves and just take bats out, Aaron, just stuff them in just like a giant locust, just bang, like incredible, isn't it? They're just like they're such a cute looking frog, the most the classic looking tree frog. They think nothing of stuffing anything they can fit in their mouths straight in. I mean, I was able to, I had them as pets, and some of mine were big enough to eat. I'd defrost mice and wiggle the mice in front of it, and it'd just have no problem stuffing one of them in its mouth and gulp it down. But yeah, they're formidable predators for sure.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting.